Yeah.
So I wanted to say, a I had a yoga teacher who would say if you're looking in your rear view mirror
Uh-huh.
and you feel bitter, then
Uh-huh.
you probably have to change where you're driving. And if you're looking in your rear view mirror and you feel grateful, then you're probably on the right path.
Ah,
So, like, really, how do you look at your past, right? How are you approaching things like that? And how you approach your present is usually very affected by how you feel about your past.
yes, yes. Yeah. So my guess is that it's really is that what you said actually really is that, for some of the people who really actually went through trauma, unfortunate
Mhm.
trauma, right? And how do you deal with that? You know,
Yeah.
because by, like being defeated by that traumatic, event is not in any way helping you now and the future.
Yeah, and I think that moving through past, um, serious trauma is very, very different for everybody, and I think that there are a lot of phases that you can go through with it, and I
Mhm,
don't think any of it is wrong,
mm,
and I think that a lot of it, unfortunately, takes a lot of time.
mhm,
So, you know, can you like how do you feel about your past trauma, right? Is sort of going to be the determiner of where you're at with it.
mhm,
How you feel when you think about it or when you talk about it, how
mhm,
much it actually is like presently affecting your brain.
mm.
And you'll be able to see kind of what your neural pathways are doing when you're talking about it or sharing it with people. I feel like that's a really big determiner
Mhm,
of sort of where you're at with it.
mhm, mhm. But I think in this case, really is that, it really need a very strong and probably needs to be built gradually, for that strong self-love and self-compassion.
Yeah, and I think that can take a long time, so it can become very frustrating for people.
Mhm,
Um, but it is entirely possible. I think a lot of healing with that kind of stuff, obviously, it also depends on what kind of trauma it was.
mhm,
But physical, sexual trauma, you can really move a lot of that energy out through body work and body awareness and becoming compassionate with the body.
mhm.
Mental trauma, I mean, all of it sits inside of the body, but mental trauma and things like that, that can be a little approached a little bit differently.
Mm, mhm, mhm. Yes. Yeah. Compared to most of the other people, like when I was in middle school, for 5 years, not being accepted into, the youth communist party, uh, because it lasted for 5 years. So that unacceptance, right? To me, it became
Mhm.
trauma, you know. But the thing is that still I was very young, was only between 11 and 15-year old, right? So actually later on, as you move on into adulthood, I kind of like actually totally forgot about
Mhm.
the event. But it does not mean it's not affecting us, It
Right.
affected me dramatically because, and I didn't really realizing that and then began to re-remember of the dramatic events every single year that I was experiencing during these 5 years. And I noticed was that when I was doing meditation and the teacher was asking us, to kind of like, like just, think about it that what kind of like childhood things is stuck in your head, right? It
Mhm.
was only through that I began to realizing, oh my God, suddenly there was this kind of like, sadness and everything comes up, the feeling comes up, and that connected me, for a long, 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 long time. I couldn't really understand why certain situations, it just gets me angry,
Mhm.
yeah.
Right. And I think that's a really good example of like mental trauma and processing that,
Mhm.
because from 11 to 15, I mean, your brain is really developing a perspective on how people respond to you. So when you're not being accepted,
Mhm.
that's a huge factor that like you may never think about again, right? So
Yeah.
that's where it's different than like a bodily trauma, physical trauma,
Mhm.
because it can be sort of locked away for a
Yeah.
long time. And so you don't realize it's almost like that has affected so many neural pathways that it's invisible to you.
Yeah.
So you don't even notice you're acting in certain ways that are based around that past.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you can break down all the things that are sort of coming up, and this may seem burdensome or excessive, but when you can break all of that down that have stemmed from that block, from that perspective, from the trauma, right? Then, I mean, you really are limitless at that point, right? You can sort of mold your perspective entirely differently.
Yes, exactly. Because actually is that, before I connected, why certain situations gets me so angry easily.
Hmm.
Before I connected to that, I had a lot of, self-judgment, I was kind of like, well, why am I born with, a defective temper, right? I was feeling
Hmm.
shamed, and I was doing a lot of self-criticism and self-judgment, and because of that, of course, it affects of my behavior in every way, but I
Right.
didn't know why. But when I made that connection, it was a huge change, because I began to not feeling so ashamed of myself anymore, because I forgave myself, because this was just a total, like a circumstance, it's not like, I purposely did something bad or whatever. It was just a circumstance at that age of time, but it lasted so long for 5 years, right?
Hmm.
And every single year, right? And
Hmm.
so, and it was a total different shift of perspective of receiving of myself, and then of course, because that changed, then of course is that, it changed everything of my perspective of receiving of everything else that is happening,
Right, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, especially because your trauma is rooted in not being accepted. You had a really hard time accepting yourself, right? So, like, you even took that onto yourself.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of ways that things like that affect us that we don't realize,
Uh-huh.
but it sounds like you did and you, like, did the work around it, so that's really great.
Yes, yes. Actually, this is also partially is that, from my own personal experience, that I felt that to have, a routine of every day that we, it doesn't matter exactly which way that you use, you could use, a meditation, you can do a standing pose meditation, you can do like, a yoga, whatever it is that fits you, fits your schedule, develop
Mhm,
routine. Because in my case, for example, like in this case, if it wasn't, the meditative activity, I would never able to connect that, because it totally, I forgot about it, after I went, into adulthood, Yeah.
right, yeah, and that's very common for people to forget things like that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.